Somewhere in history, an empire accumulated a fortune so vast that in today's it would exceed $400 billion. And yet, very few people can clearly explain where that wealth went. It was not destroyed in a single war. It was not buried in one forgotten vault. And it did not simply disappear. Instead, it was absorbed, divided, repurposed, and quietly rewritten out of memory. Tonight, we are going to reconstruct that forgotten wealth, step by careful step, by returning to the empire that created it. An empire that ruled not only through power, but through patience, not only through conquest, but through order. Before we continue, allow me to extend a brief and quiet invitation. If you appreciate documentaries that take their time, stories built on records, archaeology, and thoughtful interpretation, you're welcome to subscribe to this channel. New films are released regularly, and for those who enjoy going deeper, additional materials and reflections are shared in the community tab. Now, let us begin our journey. When most people think of ancient wealth, they imagine gold piled high in palace vaults, jewels locked away behind stone walls, or conquered cities stripped of their treasures. But the wealth of ancient Persia was not defined by glitter alone. It was defined by systems, by land carefully measured and cultivated, by trade routes protected across continents, by laws that allowed diverse peoples to live, work, and prosper under a single authority. When modern historians attempt to translate Persia's economic reach into today's terms, adjusting for population size, productivity, territorial scale, and resource control, the numbers become extraordinary. Not millions, not tens of billions, but hundreds of billions of dollars. This figure reflects not just material riches, but something far more enduring: stability, administration, and continuity over generations. To understand how such wealth was created, we must go back, not to a throne room, but to the land itself. Ancient Persia emerged from a landscape that demanded intelligence as much as strength. The Iranian plateau lies between formidable mountain ranges and vast deserts. To the north, the Elburz Mountains captured moisture from the Caspian Sea, feeding fertile valleys. To the west, the Zagros Mountains formed a natural barrier rich in stone and minerals. To the south, access to the Persian Gulf opened pathways to maritime trade. To the east, ancient routes connected Persia to Central Asia and the Indus Valley. This was not an easy land to dominate. Water had to be managed. Soil had to be protected. Movement required planning. Those who lived here learned early that survival depended not on excess but on balance. Over generations, Persian communities developed advanced methods of irrigation, agriculture, and seasonal planning. These skills did more than sustain life. They created surplus, and surplus in any civilization is the first step toward wealth. Long before Persia became an empire, it was a constellation of tribes bound by language, customs, and shared moral ideas. Leadership was local, wealth was modest, authority depended on trust and protection rather than decree. But even in this early phase, Persian society was shaped by a deep ethical framework, one that valued truth, responsibility, and order. These values were reinforced by religious traditions that emphasized the struggle between chaos and balance, falsehood and truth. Such ideas would later influence how Persian rulers governed wealth, not as something to exploit recklessly, but as something to steward. As centuries passed, Persian tribes observed the great powers surrounding them. They watched Assyria rise through terror and collapse through rebellion. They saw Babylon flourish in splendor, yet struggle to maintain unity. These lessons were not forgotten. They were studied. By the 7th century BCE, the ancient Near East was dominated by empires built on force. Conquest was brutal. Tribute was excessive. Rebellion was inevitable. Empires grew quickly, but they were expensive to maintain. Armies had to constantly suppress unrest. Cities were destroyed, disrupting trade and agriculture. Wealth flowed upward rapidly, but it rarely lasted. This was the world into which Persia would step, and it was into this world that a leader emerged, one whose approach to power would quietly change the rules of empire. Cyrus of Anshan inherited leadership of a small Persian kingdom, hardly a force capable of challenging the dominant Median Empire. Yet Cyrus possessed a rare quality: restraint. When he defeated the Medes, he did not annihilate them. Instead, he absorbed their institutions, respected their elites, and preserved their administrative knowledge. This pattern would repeat itself across Cyrus's campaigns. When Babylon fell to Persian control in 539 BCE, the city was not razed, its temples were spared. Its people were not enslaved. Religious practices were respected. Displaced populations were allowed to return home. To modern ears, this may sound humanitarian. To ancient observers, it was revolutionary. But beyond morality, Cyrus's policies had an economic consequence that cannot be overstated. Cities that were spared destruction continued to function. Farmers returned to their fields. Markets reopened. Trade resumed almost immediately. Instead of draining conquered regions dry, Persia integrated them. And integrated regions generate wealth far more reliably than devastated ones. With each expansion, Persia's economic base widened. Land was surveyed and recorded. Tribute was standardized. Local economies were preserved rather than dismantled. Persia did not demand everything at once. It demanded sustainability. This approach allowed wealth to accumulate quietly, year after year. Grain flowed into imperial storehouses. Silver moved through regulated trade. Skilled labor remained productive instead of being displaced. The empire began to function less like a conquering force and more like a vast economic organism. And at its center stood administration. To rule a territory stretching from the Aegean Sea to the edges of India required more than military strength. Persia solved this problem through structure. The empire was divided into satrapies, administrative regions governed by officials responsible for taxation, justice, and order. These governors were carefully monitored by royal inspectors and balanced by separate military commanders. No single official held absolute power. Taxes were assessed according to regional capacity. Agricultural regions paid in grain. Commercial centers paid in silver. Pastoral lands contributed livestock. This system did something rare. It allowed wealth to flow to the center without destroying productivity at the edges. As a result, Persia achieved something few empires ever have: scale without chaos. It is important to pause here, because Persia's wealth was not created through excess cruelty or endless plunder. It was created through continuity. Through policies that allowed people to remain where they were, doing what they did best, under a system that valued order over destruction. This does not mean Persia was without conflict, inequality, or ambition, but it does mean that its wealth was built on foundations strong enough to endure. By the time Cyrus's successors ruled, Persia was no longer an emerging power. It was a system spanning continents, and its greatest accumulation of wealth was still ahead. In the next part of this documentary, we will follow the arteries of this empire, its roads, trade routes, communication networks, and taxation systems, to understand how Persian wealth multiplied on a scale the ancient world had never seen before. We will also begin to examine how historians arrive at the modern valuation of $400 billion, and why Persia's true riches cannot be understood by gold alone. For now, remember this: Persia did not stumble into wealth, it engineered it. By the time Cyrus the Great died, Persia had already become something rare in the ancient world, an empire that expanded without tearing itself apart. Yet conquest alone does not create lasting wealth. Wealth emerges when people are able to move safely, trade freely, communicate reliably, and plan for the future with confidence that order will endure. Persia understood this instinctively. Where other empires invested primarily in armies, Persia invested in connection. As the empire grew, so too did the complexity of governing it. Lands stretched across multiple climates, languages, religions, and economic systems. Managing such diversity required more than authority. It required structure. The Persian solution was administration on a scale the world had never seen. Each satrapy was carefully mapped and assessed. Governors were selected not only for loyalty, but for competence. Records were kept in multiple languages, ensuring that orders and laws could be understood locally. Most importantly, Persian governance separated powers. The satrap collected taxes and oversaw civil administration. Military commanders answered directly to the king. Royal inspectors, often referred to in later sources as the eyes of the king, traveled the empire, reviewing accounts and listening to grievances. This balance reduced corruption and prevented the concentration of power. From an economic perspective, this meant something extraordinary. Wealth could be extracted predictably, without destabilizing local production. In many ancient empires, taxation was arbitrary. Regions were forced to pay whatever the ruler demanded, often resulting in famine, rebellion, or economic collapse. Persia took a different approach. Taxes were standardized based on regional capacity. Fertile agricultural regions contributed grain and livestock. Commercial hubs paid in silver. Regions rich in specific resources contributed goods rather than currency. This system achieved two things at once. First, it ensured a steady flow of wealth into the imperial treasury. Second, it preserved the productivity of the provinces themselves. When people know what is expected of them, and know that expectations will not suddenly change, they plan, invest, and produce more. In modern terms, Persia created predictable fiscal policy. Perhaps no single Persian innovation contributed more to wealth than the royal road. Stretching more than 2,000 kilometers from Anatolia to Mesopotamia, the royal road was not simply a path. It was an integrated infrastructure system. Way stations were placed at regular intervals. Horses were kept ready. Messengers could travel day and night. Goods moved faster than ever before across vast distances. For the first time, an empire could communicate with its edges in days rather than months. This transformed commerce. Merchants traveled with confidence, knowing roads were protected. Markets expanded. Prices stabilized. Information, often more valuable than goods, circulated rapidly. The royal road did not just move wealth, it multiplied it. Persia understood that trade cannot flourish without safety. Roads were patrolled. Banditry was punished severely. Local authorities were held accountable for maintaining order within their regions. This created an environment in which long-distance trade became not only possible but routine. Spices from the east, textiles from India, metals from Anatolia, and agricultural surplus from Mesopotamia flowed through Persian-controlled networks. Each exchange generated revenue through taxes, tolls, and commercial activity. Wealth accumulated not in sudden windfalls but in constant motion. One of Persia's most overlooked contributions to economic history was standardization. Weights and measures were regulated. Currency was minted to consistent standards. Contracts were enforced through recognized legal procedures. This reduced uncertainty. A merchant in Sardis could trade with confidence in Babylon, knowing that a unit of silver would mean the same thing in both places. Trust in economic systems is priceless. Persia institutionalized it.
Herodotus famously wrote that nothing traveled faster than Persian messengers, not snow, not rain, not heat, nor gloom of night. This network was not a poetic exaggeration. Messages moved continuously across the empire, ensuring that decisions could be made with current information. Orders could be enforced quickly. Crises could be addressed before they spread. From an economic standpoint, this reduced loss. Delayed information is costly. Persia minimized delay. As wealth flowed inward, it was not allowed to stagnate. Persian treasuries were strategically placed, not centralized in a single location. This reduced risk and ensured that funds could be deployed quickly for infrastructure, defense, or relief. Persepolis served not only as a ceremonial capital, but as a symbolic center of imperial wealth, a place where tribute from across the empire was recorded and displayed. But much of Persia's wealth remained in motion, circulating through the economy rather than sitting idle. This circulation sustained growth. At this point, it becomes clear that Persia's wealth was not accidental. It was the result of deliberate choices: stability over terror, administration over chaos, integration over destruction. These choices created conditions under which wealth could grow quietly, year after year across generations. Few empires have achieved this balance. Fewer still maintained it for centuries. If so much wealth existed, why does so little remain today? And what happened when Persia's carefully balanced system encountered a conqueror who did not share its values? Up to this point, much of Persia's wealth has existed in systems, roads, laws, trade, and administration. These forms of wealth are powerful, but they are largely invisible. Yet every empire eventually gives its wealth a physical form. For Persia, that form was Persepolis. Not a city in the conventional sense, but a ceremonial heart, a place where the empire gathered to remember itself. Persepolis rose from the rocky plains of southern Iran, not as a crowded metropolis, but as a monumental complex. Its terraces, columns, and stairways were designed to impress not through excess decoration, but through scale and precision. This was not a palace meant for constant habitation. It was a statement. Reliefs carved into stone show delegations from across the empire: Medes, Egyptians, Babylonians, Lydians, Indians, each bringing tribute. The scenes are orderly, dignified, and calm. No chains, no scenes of violence, only procession. This imagery mattered. It communicated that Persia ruled not through fear but through participation. Behind the ceremonial facades lay something more tangible: imperial treasuries. Clay tablets discovered at Persepolis reveal meticulous records of rations, payments, and supplies. Workers were paid in grain, wine, and silver. Skilled laborers received higher compensation. Women appear in the records as administrators and recipients of rations. These are not the records of a plundering regime. They are the records of a functioning economy. Within these treasuries flowed tribute from across the empire: precious metals, textiles, livestock, and crafted goods. Some of it was stored, much of it was redistributed. Persian wealth did not stagnate behind walls, it moved. The tribute system was not merely extraction. Each region contributed according to its strength. This reinforced local specialization and encouraged productivity. A region known for horses supplied horses. A region rich in agriculture supplied grain. This created interdependence. The empire functioned like a vast network, each part contributing to and benefiting from the whole. From an economic perspective, this diversity reduced risk. If one region suffered drought, another compensated. Stability was preserved. Ceremony itself was a form of investment. Annual gatherings at Persepolis reinforced loyalty among regional elites. Public displays of order reassured subjects that the empire was strong and predictable. Predictability lowers uncertainty. Lower uncertainty increases economic confidence. Persia understood that symbols, when used carefully, could protect wealth as effectively as armies. Ancient sources describe Persian treasuries holding vast quantities of silver and gold. When Alexander later captured Persian capitals, records suggest that tens of thousands of talents were seized. Even allowing for exaggeration, the scale is undeniable. But it is essential to remember this treasure represented surplus, not the entirety of Persian wealth. Most economic activity remained distributed across the empire in fields, workshops, markets, and trade routes. This distinction matters. Empires that concentrate all wealth in one place are vulnerable. Persia distributed it. Wealth is not only measured at the top. Archaeological and textual evidence suggests that artisans, farmers, and traders under Persian rule enjoyed relative stability. This did not mean equality, but it did mean opportunity. Work was rewarded, contracts were recognized, property was respected. These conditions allowed wealth to accumulate at multiple levels of society. In modern economic terms, Persia supported a broad base of productivity. One of the most remarkable aspects of Persepolis records is the visibility of women. Women appear as workers, supervisors, and recipients of rations. Some controlled significant resources, others managed estates. This inclusion expanded the productive capacity of the empire. Wealth grows when more people are allowed to contribute meaningfully. Persia understood this quietly. Popular imagination often pictures ancient wealth as hidden hoards. Persia challenges this myth. Yes, treasuries existed, but far more wealth flowed continuously, paying workers, funding infrastructure, supporting religious institutions, and maintaining trade networks. This circulation is why Persian wealth endured. Yet no system is immune to disruption. The very visibility of Persian wealth, its order, its scale, its openness, also made it a target. As long as Persia's philosophy of governance held, wealth flowed steadily. But when that philosophy was confronted by a different vision of power, the system would be tested in ways it was never designed to withstand. For nearly 2 centuries, Persian wealth had been protected not by walls alone, but by systems, administration, trust, predictability, and integration. But systems are fragile when confronted by a power that does not recognize their value. In the late 4th century BCE, that power arrived from the West. Its leader was young, ambitious, and driven by a vision very different from that of the Persian kings. His name was Alexander of Macedon. By the time Alexander crossed into Asia Minor, Persia was still wealthy, but it was no longer unified in spirit. Court politics had weakened central authority. Some satraps governed efficiently, others ruled cautiously, uncertain of support from the capital. Loyalty remained, but confidence had begun to fracture. Persia's system had been designed for continuity, not shock. Alexander's campaign was shock. The Persian army was vast, but slow to adapt. At Granicus, Issus, and later Gaugamela, Persian forces were defeated, not because they lacked courage, but because the empire's strength lay elsewhere. Persia was built to administer, not to respond rapidly to a highly mobile, aggressive force. With each victory, Alexander gained not just territory, but access to treasuries. Ancient sources describe staggering amounts of treasure falling into Alexander's hands. In Sardis, in Babylon, in Susa, and eventually in Persepolis itself, wealth accumulated over generations was suddenly exposed. Tens of thousands of talents of silver and gold were seized, amounts so large that Alexander was forced to reorganize logistics simply to move them. This was not economic integration. This was extraction. When Alexander entered Persepolis, he stood at the ceremonial heart of the Persian world. What followed has been debated for centuries. Some accounts describe a deliberate burning of the palaces, a symbolic act meant to signal the end of Persian dominance. Others suggest it was an impulsive act, fueled by drink and triumph. Whatever the cause, the result was the same. A center of memory was destroyed, and with it, the symbolic cohesion of Persian wealth. The destruction of Persepolis did not erase Persian wealth overnight. Fields still produced crops, trade routes still existed, local economies continued, but the system that coordinated them had been fractured. Records were lost. Administrative continuity was broken. Wealth that once circulated predictably now flowed unevenly, often outward. Alexander redistributed Persian treasure to fund his campaigns, reward soldiers, and establish new cities. Wealth that had been stabilized was suddenly mobilized for conquest. Persian wealth did not disappear. It moved. Silver entered Greek economies. Gold funded Hellenistic expansion. Persian administrative knowledge was absorbed and adapted. In this sense, Persia's wealth helped build the world that replaced it, but it no longer served Persia. Without centralized coordination, regional economies began to diverge. Some prospered under new rulers, others declined. Infrastructure deteriorated without consistent maintenance. Trade routes became less secure. Wealth, once sustained through balance, became vulnerable to fragmentation. This is the cost of collapse, not immediate ruin, but long-term erosion. Alexander admired Persian splendor, but he did not replicate Persian systems. His empire relied on personal loyalty and military presence. When he died unexpectedly, it fractured almost immediately. The Persian model had emphasized endurance. The Hellenistic model emphasized momentum. Momentum fades. Over time, Persia's wealth was absorbed into successor states, empires, and economies. Its influence persisted, but its identity faded. Later empires would inherit Persian ideas without always recognizing their source. Standardized administration, provincial governance, road systems, tolerance as policy. These concepts lived on, but the empire that perfected them did not. It is tempting to see Persia's fall as inevitable, but history rarely works that way. Persia was not defeated because it was weak. It was defeated because its strength lay in stability, not aggression. Its wealth was designed to grow slowly, not to defend itself suddenly against shock. This distinction matters. In the final part of this documentary, we will step back and ask a modern question. How do historians calculate the astonishing figure of $400 billion? What does that number really represent? And what can the hidden wealth of ancient Persia teach us about prosperity, memory, and the quiet forces that shape history? At the beginning of this journey, we introduced a figure that seemed almost implausible, $400 billion. Not as a headline meant to shock, but as a question meant to invite understanding. Now, with the story of Persia fully before us, its land, its systems, its trade, its administration, and its fall, we are finally in a position to ask, what does that number actually mean? And perhaps more importantly, what does it not mean? Ancient economies cannot be measured the way modern ones are. There were no stock markets, no GDP reports, no centralized banking systems. So historians rely on indirect methods, careful, conservative, and comparative. Examine the size of the population under Persian control, agricultural output across vast fertile regions, control of major trade routes linking 3 continents, recorded tribute and taxation systems, known quantities of precious metals, infrastructure investment, and administrative reach. Factors are then compared to modern economic equivalents, adjusted for population share and global productivity. When this is done carefully, Persia consistently emerges as controlling a staggering percentage of the world's economic output during its height. In some estimates, as much as 40–45% of known global production. That is how historians arrive, not at an exact figure, but at a range. And within that range, the modern equivalent of $400 billion becomes not sensational but reasonable. Persia's wealth is easy to underestimate for one simple reason. It did not announce itself loudly. Unlike Rome, Persia did not leave behind endless triumphal arches celebrating conquest. Unlike Egypt, it did not build monuments meant to defy time through sheer mass. Persia invested in function. Roads that wore away, records written on clay, administrative practices absorbed by later empires. Its greatest achievements were meant to work, not to impress. And because of this, much of Persia's wealth dissolved quietly into the civilizations that followed. When Alexander seized Persian treasuries, that wealth did not sit idle. It financed the spread of Greek culture. It built cities from Egypt to Central Asia. It paid soldiers, artisans, and administrators. Persian wealth helped create the Hellenistic world. Later, Persian systems influenced Roman administration. Roman systems influenced Europe, and through this chain, Persia's ideas shaped the foundations of modern governance and economics. In this sense, Persian wealth never vanished. It was inherited. There is a distinction worth making here. Riches are accumulations. Wealth is a system. Riches can be seized in a single moment. Wealth requires time, trust, and continuity. Persia mastered the second, and that is why its legacy endured long after its political power faded. Persia teaches us something that modern societies often forget: that prosperity grows best in environments of stability. That diversity, when managed with fairness, strengthens rather than weakens systems. That respect for local culture, for labor, for order, pays long-term dividends. Persia did not promise equality, but it offered predictability. And predictability allows people to build. Today, discussions of wealth often focus on speed, rapid growth, instant returns, short-term dominance. Persia reminds us that the most powerful systems are often the quietest. They are built slowly. They expand carefully. They endure because they are trusted. This is why Persia deserves to be remembered not just as an empire, but as an economic civilization. History remembers what is loud: battles, burning cities, victors and defeats. But it often forgets what is patient: roads maintained for generations, administrators balancing fairness and authority, farmers whose surplus fed an empire. The hidden wealth of Persia was never meant to be hidden. It was simply never meant to be shouted. Perhaps the most remarkable thing about ancient Persia is not how wealthy it was, but how much of that wealth was shared, circulated, and sustained. In a world obsessed with accumulation, Persia offers a different definition of prosperity, one rooted not in excess, but in order. If you've enjoyed this kind of quiet historical exploration, stories that reward patience and reflection, you're welcome to subscribe to the channel. I also share additional sources, follow-up questions, and extended reflections in the YouTube community tab, for those who enjoy continuing the conversation beyond the documentary. Thank you for spending this time with me.